Hi, everyone. We're here for the second webinar led by our team from Wisconsin Evaluation Collaborative. This one is about evidence and data collection. So I'm going to go ahead and share screen and we will get started.
Great, thank you. My name is Annalie Good, and I am at the Wisconsin Evaluation Collaborative, which is in the School of Education at UW-Madison. And we have a longstanding partnership with Serve Wisconsin to be evaluation partners in building capacity of not only the State Commission, but also of grantees and applicants, which is part of what today's webinar is about.
Hello, I'm Nikki Bowman. I'm also from the Wisconsin Evaluation Collaborative within the Wisconsin Center for Ed Research at UW-Madison, and I'm a scientist and culturally responsive evaluator, and I also have been on the WEC Serve Wisconsin partnership for many years, so looking forward to getting you excited about evaluation, evidence, and data collection. I love it. We hope to.
Great. Thank you. So we're going to start, first of all, slide please, with talking about how to build up an evidence base, because obviously that's a really important part of your application. And then building up the evidence base is only as useful as the actual data collection that you're collecting. So we'll talk about how to build high quality data collection systems. And then we've collected some general tips and resources from the program officers and then also from the evaluation team's experience working with grantees and applicants. The goals are for you to leave this session with a solid understanding of what the corporation expects in terms of how you're going to build evidence and what types of evidence, and then also to equip you with lots of different resources that the corporation has for you to use after this presentation is done. So again, there are lots of different themes that come through this work, whether we're talking about building an evidence base or building your program design or talking about your logic model. And culture and cultural context and cultural identities are central to the work that we do. Dr. Bowman and I come at evaluation from a culturally responsive evaluation lens. And part of what that does for us is to help us constantly reflect on the cultural contexts in which we're working, and also our own cultural identities and what that brings into the work in terms of the lenses and how we make sense of what needs to be done, how do we do it, and what outcomes are we hoping we get when we do it. And so this definition, I'll read it from what's on the screen. Culture and context are dynamic systems of social values, cognitive codes, behavioral standards, worldviews, and beliefs used to give order and meaning to our own lives, as well as the lives of others. So as human beings, culture is kind of what makes us our species. It's how we make sense of ourselves. It's how we make sense of how we organize ourselves. It's how we make sense of one another. And so we can't remove it from a process such as developing a program or thinking about the evidence of that program. It's actually threatens the validity of that process for us to think that we can actually remove it from this process. So we'll keep talking about the ways in which we do that as we talk through how to build an evidence base and also how to build data collection systems that are aligned to that evidence base. Slide, please. So one of the other themes that you're going to hear throughout this presentation is around alignment. So building alignment is not only about building alignment between different pieces of evidence, but also between the evidence itself and your design. So in previous sessions, we've talked about a theory of change and a logic model and how that is an expression of what your, again, logic is. What are you thinking are the activities of what you're going to do and what the outcomes of those activities are going to be, and what are the different components of your program. It is critical that you then align what you're putting out there as evidence to that theory of change and to that logic model and to then your narrative of the program design itself. Slide, please. So the corporation has a continuum of evidence that it is helpful to absorb this, because then it helps you to understand how the corporation thinks about evidence and different levels of evidence. So on the left-hand side of this, you see evidence informed. And on the far right-hand side, you see evidence-based. And essentially the difference between the two is where is the evidence coming from and how tightly aligned is it to your actual program. So evidence informed is when there is evidence somewhere out there that a program design similar to yours is doing the things that it's saying it's hoping to do. So this is where you're developing, maybe you're at the stage of even just developing a program, and you look out into the wider world to see, okay, what is the evidence? Is there research on a particular program model that we're thinking about implementing? That can inform your program design as evidence, but from another program, but it's one that is similar to yours. Whereas on the far right-hand side, evidence-based is when you have developed evidence specific to your program that is showing positive outcomes, and that from the corporation standpoint, for it to be truly evidence-based all the way on the right-hand side of that continuum, is that you've developed and you've collected evidence with specific design, specific methodologies, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Okay, slide please.
Annalee?
Yes, please.
Good. Sorry. One thing that I would like to say for this evidence base that I think is relevant to our Serve Wisconsin applicants and currently funded programs is that when WEC did the Serve Wisconsin evaluation study last year, evidence was the one place that our programs felt frustration about because evidence tiers are very hard to meet under CNCS. And so out of that grew the strategy to start small like the turtle and just keep moving in the right direction. Okay, we know that when you're doing direct programming, and sometimes programs don't have, you know, a research arm inside of the organization, that it's going to take you a while to build your evidence tier. I also would like to put a plug in for our technical assistance sessions, that if you're thinking about evidence, whether it's short term for an application, or if you're trying to build out what can we do in the next 6 months, 12 months, 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, whatever, WEC is a place that you can call to help you sort of be a thought partner and sort of think these things through, both in application and with your program. So those are my two little caveats and plugs. And I don't know, Dr. Good, if you or Serve Wisconsin has anything else to add to that, but just wanted to sort of put that out up front.
Yeah, thank you. That there's, you know, even just thinking about what are different ways to define evidence is complicated enough. And then in the specific context of federally funded programs and the specific context of the corporation, then there are particular ways that then evidence is defined. So the federal government tends to follow this idea that evidence-based means you have evidence from a very particular type of methodology. There are others that, you know, might broaden that definition to say that qualitative work, for example, can help you define whether or not something is working. So there's a larger debate in the field. There's a larger debate out in the world around what is evidence, who gets to define whether or not something is working. But for the purposes of today, we're talking specific to how CNCS is defining it and how you can talk about it in the context of your application. But please remain in a reflective place from a program coordinator position of how are you thinking about evidence and how are your own cultural lenses informing how you think about evidence, and what does evidence mean in the community in which you're working. So stay in a reflection mode while you're also then having to, at the same time, hold on to the ways that the corporation are defining these things. Okay, so within the application, there's kind of two different places where you've got to talk about evidence. One is for you to determine what tier you're at, and we'll talk about what those tiers are in a second. But the tier is determined by what are you saying your evidence is for your logic model. So for example, did you actually do an evaluation study of your program? And if so, what did it show? And did it show something positive? Is your evidence just specific to performance data, performance measure data that you've collected in the past? Or is your evidence determined basically by research studies of other programs that are similar in design as yours? So again, there's mandatory supplemental guidance in the application process that really gives a very specific definition of evidence-based versus evidence-informed. And this is one of those places where when you're writing an application, you have to use the language of the funder, even if you don't necessarily agree with how they're defining it. And there can be spaces for you to disagree in an application process as well. But that using that, if you were to say that your program is evidence-based in your application, that sends up a signal to the reviewers that they're going to be looking for very specific things. And so make sure that you're not using a term that's going to signal things that you don't mean to signal. And that's an important place where that's going to come down, is evidence-based versus evidence-informed. Okay, so the quality of evidence, and when they say quality, they basically mean how much of what kind and what is it specific to. So these are the tiers. There are 4 tiers. The first tier is pre-preliminary, which means that your evidence base consists of either past performance measure data and or research studies from programs that are similar to yours, not of yours, but that are similar to yours. The second is preliminary. So your evidence base in a preliminary tier is that you have done evaluations of your program that have shown positive outcomes, but that those evaluations are using particular designs and particular methods that are, for example, a pre-post assessment. So you did a survey of participants in a nutrition ed workshop. You did a survey before the workshop, and you did a survey after the workshop about their skills, knowledge, and attitudes towards healthy foods. And that pre and post showed that there was a positive growth in the skills, knowledge, and or attitudes of the participants. That would be what a pre-post assessment is without a comparison group. If you did, so another example of evidence within the preliminary tier is if you only did a post assessment. So for example, you assessed participants' knowledge, skills, or attitudes towards nutrition after the workshop, but then you also gave that assessment to a group of similar people who were not in the workshop, so that you had this element of comparison. So evidence falling into one of those would be preliminary. Moderate evidence would be that you have evaluations from your program that show a positive impact. Okay, now here's how it differs from preliminary. In the moderate tier, that evidence of positive changes was being shown through a particular methods. And those particular methods are called quasi-experimental. So they're not experimental, meaning you didn't have 2 groups of similar people that you randomly assigned to 2 different groups, one of whom got the workshops and one didn't. That type of experimental design almost never happens in the AmeriCorps world, because it takes a tremendous amount of resources and sometimes is flat out unethical. If there's something is probably going to be beneficial to a group of people, and you as part of experimental design, withhold that from a group of people who need it, you have some ethical concerns. So don't ever think that you have to do experimental design, because very, 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 very few do it. Quasi-experimental is when you try to get at an experimental design, but on the other end. So you take data that was already collected, or you take data across a large group of people, and then you create and construct comparison groups from those data, and then compare that. And you use an assessment, either a pre-post and or just a post, to then kind of create, again, that's why it's quasi-experimental. It's not actually randomly assigning people to either get the workshop or not, but it's creating groups that are otherwise similar to look at outcomes. And so that moderate will show impact. And that last one is strong. So the difference between strong and moderate is that you're doing that same design, but at multiple different sites. So the vast majority of AmeriCorps funded programs fall in the pre-preliminary and preliminary, some in the moderate, very, very, very few in the strong. The ones that tend to be strong are the larger national organizations that have multiple sites and the capacity to do that type of evaluation. So expect yourself, especially if you're just in the beginning stages of creating a program, expect yourself to be in the pre-preliminary. Okay, I'm going to pause. If there's anything, Dr. Bowman, you want to add in, or Alexis, if you want to add in about the evidence tiers or just building an evidence base before we get into the data systems.
Well, as we transition from evidence-based to data systems, to me, a lot of it is about resources and capacity, and having an internal awareness of what's possible and where you want to go. So as you think back to, because I know the next slide is connecting, making connections, right? Across the program design and the theory of change and then the evidence base. So if we could have the next slide. It's very important that your alignment, as you look from the program design rectangle to the evidence design rectangle, that you're thinking about the big picture here and the capacities that you have. So as you want to move down the evidence tier, if that's what you would like to do in your first grant or your second grant or across multiple grants, if you're lucky to have many funding streams coming in from CNCS or repeated funding streams, it is more money to have stronger evidence. So you have to sort of shift and you have to put that out in front if that's what you're going to be doing, because your program is working and you want to be able to have a more robust design and a more heavy evidence base as you look at the levels of what counts, because you have multiple sites and you really want to test and see if that works, So as you think about alignment, it matters with the program design, it matters with the evidence, it also matters with your budget as you sort of line things up. And I can't emphasize strongly enough what Dr. Good said about we hear evidence-based, evidence-informed all the time. It's supremely important that you know how CNCS defines it. And they have supplementary materials on what counts as evidence-based versus evidence-informed. It's quite a robust supplementary material that they give you. Same thing with their performance metrics. If you want to go down that rabbit hole, they use one of the Dr. Good analogies that she used, but we have these links later on. And so as we move to the next slide and we talk about benefits of collecting high quality data, you really have to think, are we an organization that is mostly programming, leadership and programming, one direct service, or do we have capacity and capabilities within human beings to add on data collection? Do we have the capacities and competencies for the software that you might need to use to collect data? Do you have the capacity and competencies with individuals to create survey designs or experimental or quasi-experimental designs, or even just external evaluation? Or are you going to have to hire an outside evaluator to help you with this work? If you hire an outside evaluator, they're working with the program leader, one of the staff. These are really all fall under the first bullet of sound basis for decision making. You aren't going to be judged if you don't have high quality data right away. But before you can make a plan to get to high quality data, even if it's on the first tier, you need to understand what is the most important data to collect. And again, go back to the theory of change. Remember the needs, the community needs or the needs of the problem. There's statistics there. Those statistics should line up with the back end here of what you're collecting in terms of high quality program data. They also should align with what CNCS provides you for guidance for high quality data, for what they're going to require you to report on in terms of annual, your performance metrics that you have. For the program, and then of course any local information that will be helpful to you when you're collecting your data. So think about capacity, and if you don't have the capacity, then you're going to have to either buy capacity. You're going to have to buy capacity internally, pay for a half-time person, get some software to help. It's usually a combination thereof, or you're going to have to pay somebody from the outside to help do that. So really, as an organization and as a program, think about where that is. Or is this something you're going to expect to set on, a staff member's table who already has 100% time? It's collecting good data and setting up the systems to collect good data and the instruments and actually doing the good data collection, analyzing it and writing up takes quite a bit of effort in terms of time and money and skills and competencies. And that's just basic evaluation, let alone if you're adding cultural and contextual elements to that, or a level of complexity and sophistication based on the tier you're at, or if you have multiple sites, or if you have hard to reach communities. And I would say in light of COVID, high quality data is going to take a longer time to collect, because part of this might be, depending on what happens now through to be determined, people are dealing with a lot of things. They're on a lot of video and web calls, and you really need to take that into consideration so you're building in for that human connection, because when you have human connections, you get high quality data. It's not just about the competencies and skills you have or the software you have or the instrument you have. You have to have human beingness first, and that's what gets you valid and trustworthy and good data, higher response rates in normal circumstances. And so I would strongly suggest you looking out there, including on the CNCS website, about how to do data collection and how to connect in virtual settings, especially under the current pandemic. And then again, high quality data helps you improve the quality of the services and programming. Are you meeting outcomes? So we'll be talking about the formative and summative evaluation a little bit later. Accountability, you know, that's for monitoring. Are people doing what they're saying they're doing? Are we following the milestones? If we know we have a report coming up, have we collected data? Have we implemented the program and collected data to make sure we're going to be hitting these milestones and marks? And then storytelling, both in qualitative terms and quantitative terms about your program achievement, is a great thing to do. And the CNCS reporting mechanism shouldn't be the only driver of your evaluation, but it certainly should be built in and included. Okay, next slide. Let's see, so we talk a bit about cultural competence and the way we do it, and culturally responsive evaluation doesn't mean just racial and ethnic situation, you know, components of human beings. It also means what age, you know, middle schoolers versus teenagers versus young adults versus middle-aged folks versus baby boomers all have very different ideas about lots of things in life, including how they experience the programming they're going through. So, you know, age or orientation, rural versus urban, all urban sites are the same, all rural sites aren't the same, you know, so it's really nice to be sort of competent in the culture that the community, that the programming is being implemented in. Multicultural validity is something we do talk about in terms of race and ethnicity, and we have to make sure, as Dr. Good said earlier, how BIPOC, that would be Black, Indigenous, people of color, or people with different abilities, also known as disability, or people who have had generations of poverty, or LGBTQ, two-spirit, you know, non-binary, fill in the blank, all experience life differently. And so we have to really be inclusive and care for the participants we have, and having that human being relationship will actually help you create a better evaluation and data collection, you know, plan for your program. CNCS has some, you can go to the next slide. CNCS has some instruments and guidance on this, not a lot, but at WEC we try to build those up both on our website and through Dr. Good and myself, so we are able to help just about anyone who needs help with this. On the previous slide, you saw that there are different sites of cultural competence. So whether it's within the design itself, what you used to pick to the design, to the instruments, to the program people, the evaluators, or the people who are providing it. But one thing Dr. Hazel Simonet, who also works for the WEC Center, and she's one of the most beloved and best known evaluators in the country when it comes to culturally responsive evaluation. And she knows quantitative and qualitative. It says, who are you when you show up? Everything that brought me to my 49 years was shaped by something from my parents, my social circles, my level of education, my you know, other socioeconomic status, by being cisgender female. I think I'm saying that right. See, I'm learning as we go along here, and how what we bring to the evaluation is also it's relative subjectivity, I guess. I don't believe in total objectivity. And so just being aware and being open and learning. And then how do you add that to the questions you ask, the outcomes that you're providing? Are you driven just by the funder, or are you taking into account the context and the people you're working with? It doesn't have to be either or, it can be both and. There are ways that you can braid together culture, community context, what CNCS or any other funder is asking for. And we know this because that's the fun and the passion we have for data collection and evaluation. So this whole slide could be like a week-long workshop Um, and so more on that, I guess, in the future, and when we talk to you or if you ask for technical assistance, we can provide that. But next slide. Being mindful of time. Culturally responsive evaluation comes from a body of literature. It's very, even since 2015, there have been within the last 5 years, so many more ways to look at culture across, excuse me, systems or people, how we, on the front end, do community needs assessment, engage stakeholders, how we can talk with groups of stakeholders about how we ask the right questions, how we gather data, how we check in. Even you can have youth become little data warriors and train them and have them start collecting data and information. When you share the results, I know that Dr. Good and I worked for Dane County Youth Assessment, and when we used their Dane County Youth Assessment and had, I think that was last September, right, Dr. Good?
Correct, yep.
And I'm sure there's stuff, if you look at the Dane County Youth Assessment website, we were actually able to take, I think it was the first time, and had a lot of fun, and we had breakout groups, and we literally did, after the assessment was done, we did data collection. We had breakout groups and had youth lead sort of analysis and talking about the data and what was important and where we want to be here going forward. I mean, it seems innovative, and it is, because hardly anyone does it, but it also seems so basic. Like, they are the end users for Dane County Youth Assessment of the programming we're doing, so why wouldn't we get them involved? They felt empowered. I know the middle and older age adults really were engaged. They were very enthusiastic, and I think some were quite surprised at how bright and responsive and inclusive our youth were. They're really amazing, really, really amazing. And as someone who works 10 to 12 hour days, I loved being around that young energy, because I'm young in spirit, so I felt energized. So hopefully, as you think about culturally responsive evaluation, it's not just at the end, it's all the way from the beginning to who you're talking to, how you're designing things, what you do with the findings when they come up, are they right or not, how do you check, and then how do you share them? It's not always a report. All right, next slide. Critical systems heuristics, if you're working at a systems level or across programs, multiple sites, it's really important to understand the context of which your programming is being implemented in. So how folks are motivated at different sites, or who's in charge or not at different sites. There might be some, informal sources of power. So from the tribal community, yes, there's an elected tribal government that you talk to, and program people that are running the youth programs or the social services or human services programs. But then there's also community leaders. Some are traditional, so you talk to them, and some are just, oh, we always listen to Aunt B. She's the one who knows how to take care of the kids, or if the kids are in trouble, they always go talk to her, and so it's important to understand from a context standpoint about power, and then how people are motivated or know things or do things or are legitimized through different frameworks in terms of, I guess, not just going down the same old beaten path that we normally do. Who's the head of the school? Let's get them to sign off. Does the school board need to be on? And let's put the grant in. It becomes a very different program, a very different process, and a very different way that you design and collect data. If you're thinking about critically about the different players and parts of the systems that are, that our program is affected by when we implement programming. All right, next slide. CNCS data collection system. Annalee, do you want to talk a little bit more about this?
Sure. So when you're sitting down and thinking about how am I going to collect data that is culturally responsive and that is embedded and meaningful to your cultural context and to your own experiences. So you're going to think through first, go back to your logic model, and this will help in the alignment that we keep hounding on, is you go back to your logic model and you look at the different components. So you look at resources, you look at outcomes, and you look at outputs. And you think about, where are the places that I need to collect data? You don't necessarily need to collect data along all the different parts. So the example we like to give is that sometimes the long-term outcomes are not something that you're going to be able to measure in a way that you would the outputs. How many workshops did you run with? How many people showed up? How long were they? How frequent were they? Et cetera. So first, again, go back to your logic model, think through the data you need to collect. Clearly, you need to collect data relevant to your performance measures. So that's an important place to start. Then you think about, okay, what instruments, what tools do you have to collect those data? So this is one of those places where you gotta like work smarter, not harder. So, or sometimes also harder, but work smarter first. And then look to the places where you might already be collecting data, and then assess if you feel like it's valid and high quality data. So an example is that many programs already collect output data. So they collect data that shows how many workshops they've run and how many people showed up because they have an attendance list or whatever, you know, whatever you're already collecting in your administrative data could be a really good place to start. And maybe it's that you're already collecting it, but you're not organizing it very well or easily for you to end up to be able to report on it. So maybe the task there is more about organizing your data collection, not necessarily creating a new tool. Sometimes though, you do actually need to create a new tool. So especially if you're new and you're new to CNCS or you're new to the program itself, is you might need to think about how are you going to understand, how are you going to measure whether or not your participants had a change in knowledge or had a change in skills. So that's where you actually might have to create a new tool. So we'll talk in a second about what those different tools are. But this goes back to one of those points that Dr. Bowman made earlier. Sometimes you have the capacity inside of your organization to do that. Sometimes you don't. And that there are different ways to then get capacity. One is the internet. So the internet is a magical place where there may already be a tool that exists and maybe it's really, really well aligned to your program. And there are tools out there that are not and that are total junk and don't use. Okay, obviously. But there are tools that you can go out and use that actually maybe have had a ton of research done with it and that those researchers are making it publicly available for people and programs like you to use. The issue there is that might be a really, really well-established, valid survey. But if you shoehorn it into your program and it's not actually aligned to the things that you want to know about your program, it makes it invalid. So the alignment is really super important. There can be an amazing survey that is not aligned to your actual program. This is also a place where you can lean on those outside of your organization. So for example, if there are evaluators in your life, they are good people to talk with about tools. Also think about other organizations that you're partnered with. So for those of you that are maybe partnered with a school district, they have a lot of data. They have a lot of data collection instruments. And if this is something that you can partner with them on, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. Slide, please. So these are, the next couple slides are just some examples of different data collection methods. And the issue here, we won't go into all the details on this, but the issue here again is alignment. So different tools are best for different situations. So for example, a survey will allow you to get a lot, ideally, a lot of responses across a large group of people. Hopefully that group of people is representative of those that you serve, so that you're not only getting survey responses from particular groups that skew, you know, towards one type of demographic category than another, for example. So surveys are really good for that broad picture. Interviews, focus groups, more qualitative data is often best for getting at the hows and the whys of your program. That is a good place for you to dig into feedback on the actual implementation of your activity or of your program. So standardized tests, that's another example of if you're partnering with an organization like a school district, they have assessments already. So for example, of student growth in particular learning areas, certain academic areas, that could be something that you draw from. Again, the alignment piece is really key here though. Oftentimes in K-12 education, which is where I work primarily, there's a default to certain measures. There's a default to certain tools as the catch-all measure for anything in education. And it's usually a standardized test. And that is usually, or oftentimes not well aligned to the actual outcome that you're hoping to have in your program. Slide, please. So a couple other data collection methods. The tracking sheet is an important one, I think, for a lot of programs, such as ones that you all might be designing or implementing, is that's the place where, again, you're tracking how many sessions did your members facilitate with how many people. So those are all data, and those are especially helpful for your outputs. So those tracking type documents are particularly helpful for your outputs. Okay. So a data management system, so let's get back to one of my earlier points, is that sometimes you might be collecting beautiful data, wonderful, just rich, nuanced, high quality, responsive data, and it's all jammed into binders on a shelf that is not organized in a way that you could actually go back and use it. So, and no shame with the binder. There are certainly places where they've got beautiful binders full of data. Having a management system not only will help you organize and be able to use those data better, but then there's also, of course, a data safety and privacy issue with having data systems where the participants can feel confident that that data isn't being shared with anyone who it shouldn't be shared with, or even accidentally shared with. It will also, oftentimes, if you have good data management systems, will help you in actually analyzing the data. So binders can be great, but they don't help at all with analyzing the data. Whereas Excel or Google Sheets, which are free to use, is a good starting point if you don't have any data management system. Google Sheets or Excel or some other sort of spreadsheet is such a good place to start, because not only is it a place where you can organize things, but also you can do a solid amount of analysis within those types of programs. And there's plenty of different YouTube videos out there that will show you how to do basic quantitative analysis using Excel. You can also do qualitative analysis using Excel as well. So yes, there are software systems that you can purchase that are data management systems. And sometimes those are exactly what you need. And sometimes those are the perfect fit for your purposes, but they can be expensive. And then they need oftentimes tech support. They need professional development. So contemplate your needs before going into something like purchasing a particular software. Again, this is another place where you can maybe lean on some of your community partners. There may be, for example, other community centers in town that purchased a license to a software that for you to purchase just an additional license on theirs might be much more cost efficient than you fully creating your own. Okay, slide please. So a couple different resources from the corporation in terms of analysis and reporting. So CNCS actually has a guide to how to analyze the data itself. So you're going to have to do an element of analysis when you're doing your performance measures. And then they have a guide to reporting. So how are you going to communicate these patterns in your data, not only to the corporation, but also hopefully to other stakeholders as well. Part of a culturally responsive design when you're thinking about your evidence base and data collection is that when you ask feedback from people, when you do a focus group or when you do a survey, part of your responsibility is to then come back to the groups that you have taken their time and expertise and experience in asking their feedback, is to come back to them with the patterns that you're finding or with the reporting, so that it's a cycle. It's not just you're coming in and taking and then they never see you again. So that's part of the reporting, that cycle. Okay. Any other additions, Dr. Bowman, that you have, or Alexis, that are specific to data collection systems or evidence bases?
Just make it part of your long-term planning, not just program planning, but if you do strategic planning or if you do regular leadership meetings, and make it a systems approach of the organization's behavior, because there's probably, based on your organization, there's probably, I don't know, 3 to 5 to 10 key indicators that all program areas probably collect data on. And the more you can make it part of an institutional and day-to-day operations part of your work, just like if you have, workforce data, HR data, those types of things, the easier it will be, and helps sort of build in that competency and capacity, and just make it for the longer haul.
Great.
And I'll just add and wrap up as it was mentioned earlier, we do offer one-on-one consultation with Wisconsin Evaluation Collaborative, and maybe with these two individuals and maybe with some others, but the link for that is on our website. It is on the same website page that you found this video. So please feel free to utilize that, and absolutely the other resources and things with all the slides. The slides for this are also posted on our website too. So thanks for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.